Just before the final great persecution began, Eusebius talks about how well the church was doing in its spread across the Mediterranean world. And indeed, it is a heroic story, a faith that grew from believers huddled in the catacombs of Rome, but which soon covered the entire Roman Empire, and then much of Europe, and finally the world itself. At the beginning of Book 8, Eusebius, now an eyewitness, begins his work as follows. And it is quite a surprise when he talks about why the great persecution took place. Having covered the succession of the apostles from earliest times, it is most important for future generations that I deal now in the 8th book with the events of my own day. Before the persecution of my time, the message given through Christ to the world of reverence to God was accorded honor and freedom by all people, Greeks and non-Greeks alike. Rulers granted our Christians favors and even permitted them to govern provinces while freeing them from the agonizing issue of pagan sacrifice. In the imperial palaces, emperors allowed members of their own household, wives, children, and servants, to practice the faith openly, according higher favor to them than their own fellow servants. All governors honored the church leaders. Mass meetings gathered in every city. Is that incredible? Mass meetings at a time before Christians are legalized? That's kind of a different picture than we're used to, isn't it? And congregations worshiped in new, spacious churches that replaced the old. This all progressed day by day, the divine hand protecting its people from jealousy or plot, so long as they were worthy. But greater freedom brought with it arrogance and sloth. We Christians began envying and attacking one another, making war on ourselves with weapons formed of words. Church leaders attacked church leaders, and laymen formed factions against laymen, while unspeakable hypocrisy and pretense reached their evil limit. Finally, while our assemblies were still crowded, divine judgment, with its accustomed mercy, gradually started to intervene. And the persecution began with our brothers in the army. That's pretty frightening, isn't it? That he assigns the cause, not to some nasty Roman emperor, not to some nasty people in a given area who are screaming to the governor, but to Christians themselves because they weren't getting along now that they were successful. That's a lesson, I think, for the church right down to the present day. And I think it also shows the honesty of the father of church history to tell us that. It would have been so easy to give a triumphalist glory story about how we always did it right, we saints of the Lord. Nah, nothing like that. Pretty sad. Well, what happened was this. A new emperor comes along. His name is Diocletian. He said, this is ridiculous, this 22 emperors in 50 years. Let's stop all the revolts. So he purged the army, Diocletian did. He ascended the throne in 284 AD, and he decided that he is going to stop the decline of Rome, and he did. As I say, he purged the government and the army and got Rome back on track again. But he also realized that Rome was so huge that one emperor along the Tiber could not control the whole situation. And so he divided the Roman Empire into two parts. The eastern half of the Mediterranean, including Greece and everything from the Adriatic Sea eastward, would be governed by himself, Diocletian, who moved his capital to a place called Nicomedia, near Istanbul today. It's a city of Izmit, Turkey. He left a colleague named Maximian in the west who would take care of the Western Front. And both of those are now going to unleash a terrible persecution of the church. Here's a reason. One day in the year 303, when they were ready to take the sacrifices for the day to see if the day were auspicious, they would poke around in the liver of a sacrificial sheep to get the auspices. The pagan priest could not come with a proper forecast for the day. What's the matter? How come you can't tell us what to do? Something is interrupting our augury. The Christians are causing us problems. And so Diocletian decided that the Christians, indeed, enough of this, maybe Decius was right, they have got to be eradicated. And so the first thing they did was to attack the Christian church just across the main square from the palace. How do you like that? For a secret place to build your church. Go figure. And then somebody tore the notice down for the Christian persecution, which the clergy were supposed to be arrested. And they found the guy who tore the sign down. His name was Peter. Here's what they did to him. Peter was brought into a public place in order to sacrifice. When he refused, he was hoisted up naked and lashed with whips until he should give in. Since even this failed to bend him, they mixed salt with vinegar and poured it over the lacerations of his body, where the bones were already protruding. When he scorned even these agonies, a lit brazier was applied, and the rest of his body was roasted by the fire as if meat for eating, not all at once, lest he find too quick a release in death, but little by little. Still Peter clung immovably to his purpose and expired triumphantly in the middle of his tortures. Such was the martyrdom of one of Diocletian's imperial servants. And now the persecution begins in earnest. The clergy in the capital city were arrested and terminated in various horrible methods. Copies of the scripture were dragged into the public square and burnt. And then the persecution spread out over much of the east and the west, and it was particularly virulent in Caesarea, where Bishop Eusebius saw his beloved teacher Pamphilius martyred. Eusebius himself was in prison for a while, but it was worst of all down in Egypt. It may have been Christians versus lions in Rome, but in Egypt the lions were regularly controlled by the managers in charge of the beast shows so that they would be good and hungry for Christian meat. And we see representations of persecutions in various reliefs. Eusebius himself may have been sitting in a grandstand which has just been excavated at Caesarea when he himself saw some of the horror with his own eyes. Artists, of course, through the centuries have pictured the persecutions in various ways, particularly those involving beasts. It was a matter of Christians versus lions all over again in the amphitheaters of the world, but again, worst of all in Alexandria, Egypt. I made a list of the kind of persecutions that were inflicted on the Christians in the pages of the earliest Christian church historian. Christians were cudgeled to death. They were flogged with whips, tied to the rack, scraped beyond endurance, subject to general battery, beheaded, butchered by swords, picked to death by potsherds, feet stretched in stocks, dismembered noses, ears, hands, legs, limbs pulled apart by machines, people dragged through the streets, vinegar and salt put in their wounds, ordeals by fire of all kinds, being burnt at the stake, strangled, bound and drowned was a favorite, starved, crucified, hung by feet over fire to choke on the smoke, pointed reeds driven into their fingers, scorched by molten lead, fed to beasts of various kinds, including panthers, wild boars, goated bulls, dogs. And some of the punishments were diabolical. In Alexandria, they would take Christian women, strip them naked, attach one leg to one tree which they had bent over by machines, and another leg to an adjacent tree which they had bent over through the use of a windlass, and they cut the cords, and the woman was split in half. Horrendous tragic punishments inflicted on them. Eusebius tells us numbers-wise that there were 10, 20, or 30 a day, sometimes up to 60 to 100 martyrs a day, men, women, and children. There was no respect of sex or age of any kinds. Finally, the pagans got sick and tired of all this bloodshed. You can only stand so much, even if you're a beast. And so now they moderated their punishment. Now they simply did things like gouging out eyes, maiming legs, branding feet, sending victims to the mines till they dropped in their chains, and general torture, short of death. This is the horror that went on in the diabolical tortures in Egypt and elsewhere. Diocletian, as he promised, stepped down after 20 years, and he made his friend in the West, Maximian, step down also. They had agreed to do that, a 20-year term, after which their understudies would become the new emperors. Now, both of them had understudies. Maximian in the West had Constantius Chlorus, whom we'll talk about in a second, and Diocletian in the East had Galerius. And so now Diocletian retires, and for the rest of his life he grew cabbages in Yugoslavia. A little unusual for an ex-emperor. But Maximian wanted to hang on in the West, but he had to retire also. Now the new emperors are Galerius in the East and Constantius Chlorus in the West. And we have an interesting sculpture of the four emperors at the corner of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, Italy. You have Diocletian next to Maximian, and you have Constantius Chlorus next to Galerius. And the person we want to focus in on is Constantius Chlorus, which means Constantius the White or Constantius Paleface. Clorox, you know, gets its name from that, okay? He did not persecute the church in the West. We don't know why, but he was a more tolerant personality. And when Diocletian heard about it and Galerius heard about it, they said, why aren't you persecuting? And so he pulled down a church or two to fulfill the letter of the law, but he never killed anybody in the West. There was some toleration being built up in that family. And I think you may understand now when I tell you that Constantius Chlorus was the father of Constantine the Great. Constantine at that time was a hostage at the court of the Eastern Emperor Galerius. He's supposedly getting his education there, but he was again a hostage because Galerius's rival, Constantius Paleface in the West, didn't want him to get out of hand. So he had his son, you see. Chlorus was up in Britain at the time, in the city of York, and he took deathly ill. And he sent a message to the Eastern court saying, please send my son back so he can be here before I die. Galerius said no. And Constantine escaped by night and used the Roman Pony Express, in which they had a fresh mount every 7.5 miles. And every 15 miles, they had the equivalent of Howard Johnson's or whatever. And so they were able to go now. And remember, communications were as slow as transportation in those days. So if you got a head start, you're going to make it. And so he made the fastest trip ever across Europe and arrived in York, Britain, just before his father died. And when his father did, the army immediately saluted young Constantine as the new emperor. And that got the others furious, because it was the son of Maximian in the West, a cur named Maxentius, who was supposed to be the new emperor. And it didn't happen. What happened was this: Constantine pulled a Julius Caesar, in the sense that he came with an honor guard, like his whole army, came down through Gaul, that is France, came into Italy, and now there is going to be a battle for possession of the Western Roman Empire. I cannot tell you how important this rivalry was for the future of the church, or the fact that Constantine may indeed have had a pious mother named Helena, who may have instilled in him some finer values from childhood on. And so what happened was this. Maxentius sent out an army to intercept Constantine in the northern part of Italy. It was defeated. And now Constantine approaches Rome. What's Maxentius going to do? What he should have done was to seal himself inside the city, because Constantine had no siege weapons. Two kinds of warfare in the ancient world. Open field warfare, that's one. But siege warfare is a different bag. You got to have machinery, boarding towers, battering rams, bridges. Constantine didn't have those. And Maxentius was an absolute, dissolute cur is about the best name for him. He was a practitioner of the black arts. He was consulting fortune tellers and witches on regular occasions. He augured the future by having pregnant women have their bellies torn open, and he would then examine the livers of the fetuses inside. A totally evil personality. He would rape the daughters of Roman senatorial nobility, a devil incarnate. Now contrast that fellow with the approaching Constantine, who seems to have all the virtues and none of the vices. Yes, folks, it is a pretty fascinating confrontation which is developing. Maxentius decides to cut the Milvian bridge. This is the main bridge going across the Tiber River into Rome, and therefore he felt that this was part of a siege warfare tactic. But then, fortunately, some witch, oh, I could kiss her, gave Maxentius the wrong information, that if he left Rome and went out to meet Constantine on the open field of warfare, he would win. And so he believes her. Now his army leaves Rome. They rebuild the Milvian bridge, not with brick and mortar, but through a floating bridge, a pontoon bridge. And then his army marches across, and Constantine has been waiting for him under a low ridge of hills on the north bank. The night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the most important dream anybody ever had took place. This sounds almost biblical, people. This sounds as though it comes from the Old or New Testament, and Constantine swears this is exactly what happened, and it is indeed a remarkable demonstration of faith in God. Constantine, of course, is immortalized in various sculpture, which you can see. I guess the biggest of all in Rome is a 9-ton head of Constantine that used to stand on one of his statues. He decided again to approach Rome slowly to see if he might be able to suck Maxentius out of the eternal city, and so he did. North of Rome, then, the Tiber River makes a great big bend toward the east, and the main road to Rome crosses the Tiber far north of Rome at the place called the Milvian Bridge. And here is where Constantine was waiting, and the night before the battle, Constantine has a dream of Jesus talking to him and telling him in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. And the sign that he gave Constantine was the famous Chi Rho symbol, which you often see in ecclesiastical finery, altar cloths. Clergy sign their documents very often with the Chi Rho symbol, which are the first two letters for the term Christ. Chi and Rho, Christos. That's a way of saying Christ. And so Constantine makes his deal that if he wins the battle, he will convert to Christianity. The next morning, He has the Chi Rho symbol painted on his own helmet, and he has his entire army take white paint and paint the Chi Rho symbol on their shields. And of course, the infantrymen are saying, why are we doing this? Shut up and paint, And so they'll find out later the significance. And so the Battle of the Milvian Bridge began in the year 312 AD. For my money, it's the most important battle that ever happened on this planet in terms of the way the future would go. Constantine begins by faking a retreat. Maxentius's forces go running across the bridge, now pursuing Constantine, and then he wheels about and attacks them from the flank. Then they see they've been schnockered into a trap, so they try to hurry across the bridge on the other side, and they collapse the pontoon bridge. They drown, and Constantine wins the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the most important battle, quite literally, that was ever fought. The Milvian Bridge itself has been rebuilt, and it still spans the Tiber River in Rome to the present day. Constantine is now the victorious emperor. The Arch of Constantine still stands in Rome next to the Colosseum, celebrating that tremendous victory. To be sure, he's going to have troubles yet. Licinius was his colleague in the East, and he turned against the Christians, so Constantine had to defeat him in battle in the year 324. But when he finally succeeded, Constantine then rebuilt the city Byzantium into Constantinople, the great eastern capital of the Roman Empire, and he finally died in the year 337, true to his promise that he would be God's representative to the pagans, and he would do everything possible to Christianize them as well. He was a dedicated Christian, a controversial one, I'll admit. There were problems in the imperial family. For a while, he kept the pagan symbol on the other side of the Christian coinage, but then he gave that up. For a while, he called himself Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest. But don't forget, the popes to the present day yet call themselves the Pontifex Maximus, so that simply means the top clergyman. And he was baptized only on his deathbed, but the reason for that is they had the screwy idea that what you want to do is get all of your sinning done ahead of time, since baptism wipes it clean. So try to sin as much as possible before death. And that is the reason why we have Constantine baptized toward the end. And so here's a man then who took the pressure off, enabled Christianity to spread across the Mediterranean world, and to bring triumph out of tragedy, which was the story of church history in the first 3 centuries.